While I believe the current push in our society for suicide prevention is well intentioned and motivated by genuine sympathetic concern, it must be made abundantly clear, I think, that many individuals who are prevented from killing themselves by strangers, emergency first responders, and police officers intervening in an attempt are not actually being saved. We regularly see videos of someone being convinced to step off the edge of the Golden Gate Bridge, or rescued by an officer who forcibly pulls them away, usually throwing them to the ground and placing them in handcuffs. Others may be found unconscious following an overdose and revived by having their stomachs pumped of whatever ineffectual combinations of pills are ingested. We in the U.S. and other civilized constitutional democracies, so-called, will then have the person involuntarily hospitalized in a psychiatric institution, committed to the psych ward, as they say, a more palatable and therapeutic-sounding euphemism for imprisonment for the alleged crime of being a harm to oneself, quote unquote. We are frequently shown a sanitized version of all this, with optimistic, inspirational stories of regret, gratefulness, and success from the formerly suicidal, who are presented as the sole representatives of all and the evidence that it gets better. One can't help but draw parallels sometimes to some of the propagandistic documentary films of the early days of the Third Reich made by director Leni Riefenstahl, where all we see are happy patriotic crowds in the Autobahn when it was built. But Dachau and turning Jews into second-class citizens with the passing of the Nuremberg laws are never shown. The not-so-uplifting truth is that many people who have been prevented from ending their existence, as well as denied a right to avail themselves to a peaceful, dignified death by the criminalization of physician-assisted suicide, would just be returned to the same psychological suffering, or merely surviving with persistent pain from chronic physical illnesses, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, fibromyalgia, complex regional pain syndrome, osteoarthritis, pelvic floor dysfunction, pudendal neuralgia, migraines, autoimmune disorders, herniated disc, multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and the list just goes on. After being resuscitated and saved by many will be thrown right back into a despised life. A life that begets very little pleasure and an overabundance of pain. Back to the grind of working in dead-end, low-paying service jobs, being subjected to verbal and emotional abuse by bosses, co-workers, and entitled, malicious customers alike. Deported to the dilapidated, lonely apartments that cost $1,000 per month to rent or more. Their suffering, unhappiness, and angst hasn't ceased. It is only hidden from immediate view, forgotten after the life extensionist and suicide preventionist pat themselves on the back. At least the heart is still pumping oxygenated blood and being carried throughout the body, right? The remarkable recovery promised by cognitive behavioral therapy has failed to manifest, and improvement is nowhere on the horizon. They haven't met the man/woman of their dreams, and the probability of developing a serious romantic relationship is remote. All remains indefinitely the same as it ever was, to borrow from the Talking Heads song. The ruling philosophy is prolonging sentience, adding on the years rather than critically evaluating quality of life. Our dogs are afforded more compassion. We witness their aggravated suffering, their formal playfulness and energy depleted and replaced by constant pain. And we determine the ethical choice is to let the veterinarian euthanize them. They pass away peacefully in their sleep after the pentobarbital is administered in a safe environment, hopefully surrounded by their beloved human carers to lower their anxiety and provide assuring comfort in those final moments. Humans who can explicitly consent to euthanasia and who possess clear knowledge that this is a permanent solution are forced to continue suffering without relief, to wait for natural death. If control over how and when we can die is prohibited, how can we be said to be legitimately free? I would argue that forcing individuals to stay here against their own volition, sentencing them to torturous suffering for days, years, or even decades on end because of our puritanical unease with voluntary death, is no better than first-degree murder. The latter is considered morally egregious, even if the victim is shot point-blank in the head while asleep and dies instantaneously without any sensory awareness. The state's prohibition against suicide, where practically all methods of peaceful self-deliverance are illegal and doctors who dare actively assist are locked in prison, like they did to Dr. Jack Kevorkian, is causing far greater suffering both qualitatively and durationally. This imposition of torture, this stripping away of bodily autonomy and liberty, is classified as protecting the vulnerable or upholding the sanctity of life by most governments, psychiatrists, and the ecclesiastical authorities of the major religions. In the past, it was deemed heresy to reject the virgin birth, that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God who was part of a 3-in-1 Trinity, or his resurrection. 4 centuries ago, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition and, after being shown the instruments of torture, compelled to recant his scientific findings and observational arguments supporting the heliocentric model of the solar system, which he promoted in his dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. This contradicted the established dogma of the Catholic Church, where the Earth was a stationary body, the center of all things in the galaxy, and that the sun revolved around it. Martin Luther and the Protestants concurred. The heretical Galileo was still punished by spending the remainder of his life under house arrest. The blasphemous heresy of many psychiatrists and psychotherapists is cogently articulating that you do not want to be alive and will prefer non-existence. Do not reject the presupposition of the inherent goodness of being alive. Not loving all this is automatically designated as an illness and committing suicide, an act always arising from impulsivity and incorrect, distorted thinking patterns. It's all rather patronizing, as well as hypocritical in my view. Simply not wanting to live and return to an eternal oblivion that preceded the emergence of their subjective consciousness is deemed adequate cause for incarceration in an institution which often includes strip searches, violation of dignity, and even forced feeding. Then, at the same time, we have those with beliefs in supernatural beings and spiritual forces like angels, demons, and ghosts, or the historicity and biological genetic possibility of the Genesis creation myth, with Adam and Eve, the utopian Garden of Eden, talking snakes, and immortality trees being allowed in high positions in all branches of the U.S. government and at the forefront of policy making. We have fundamentalist evangelicals in Congress whose foreign policy objectives concerning the Middle East are motivated by belief in the Book of Revelation and Christian eschatology. Israel and Iran going to war is the fulfillment of such and such prophecy, they will say. And this brings us closer to Jesus' glorious triumphant return riding on a Pegasus that's been very near and coming soon for 2,000 years. I remember the primaries in 2015, Republican primaries to be exact. Ben Carson and Ted Cruz were both candidates, and both were saying that God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit was speaking to them and telling them to run for president. Something is wrong here. Let us assume this popular conception is valid about impulsivity and lack of correct thought, clarity of thought. A universal right to physician-assisted suicide or active euthanasia, which had a mandatory waiting period of 3 to 5 or 6 months. A concession I'd be willing to make if this was the only barrier to guaranteeing the right without further bureaucratic restrictions and compulsory therapy would likely reduce the number of suicides that we could plausibly consider to be impulsive. Danny from The Right to No Longer Exist used to say he was the true preventionist, wanting to prevent all the violent, gruesome deaths with firearms, knives, razor blades, jumping from tall buildings or in front of oncoming trains, or hanging by a noose. Instead of being given Nembutal intravenously by a competent medical professional in the secure familiarity of a person's bedroom, where friends and loved ones can be at their side, we opt for mutilated, dismembered bodies, tacitly accept pieces of the brain and skull fragments splattered on the walls from 12-gauge shotguns to the head. Is our anti-euthanasia, death-phobic society not merciful? Kevorkian was absolutely right when he said we're still basically in the dark ages on the issue of euthanasia and a right to a peaceful, graceful death. I hope those dark ages will come to an end soon.